Good afternoon and welcome to Fire in the Belly. Today we have myself, Mighty Pete, and we're joined with Diane Dewey. Good afternoon.
Hello, Pete. Good to be with you.
Yeah, listen, Diane, tell us, who are you and what do you do?
Oh, I think the first question is the harder question, but I can tell you, I can answer that question. I am an author. I've written a book, a memoir actually, called Fixing the Fates. And I am also a radio show host here in the United States. I have a show called Dropping In, and my subject matter and what I'm really curious about in depth is identity. Part of that is because of the fact that my whole history revolves around finding out who I am in a very kind of graphic way. I was born in Germany and I was surrendered for adoption and basically adopted by a very nice American couple, grew up here in the States and was contacted out of the blue when I was 47 years old by my biological father. So that's different for many reasons. One is that it's not usually a father that searches, and two is it's usually the adoptee that searches or desires contact with a biological parent. So those upending kind of situations, and that was a while ago now. But it really made me ask myself again, well, who am I now that I have my biological identity, my DNA? I've explored all branches of the family now, and all these questions that I had are now answered in factual ways. But it's still the ongoing evolution of that question, right? Who are we? And it's just something that fascinates me. It's constantly changing. And I got to watch Ford Ferrari the other day, the movie with Christian Bale and Matt Damon. And Christian Bale is the race car driver, and he's like at 7,000 RPM. Everything is a blur, and you're just sitting there saying, who am I? I think to myself, oh, well, that's great. I don't even really need to go that fast to do that. But it's become a life pursuit, and it is so for many adoptees, just because we do have that variation of to whom were we born, and to whom are we raised, by whom are we raised, and so who do we become. So that's basically who I am. I live in St. Petersburg, Florida, on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and we have, I would say, a very water-oriented life here. We're surrounded by water. I live on an island, and there's an 1,100-acre nature preserve just off to the left, to the south of us here, and it's a place where it's mostly little tiny islands, and it's a county park, so everyone gets to participate in it. There's nothing exclusive about it, and so it's a wonderful environment to be in. So I hope that gives you a sense of myself. I can be relatively solitary on account of being a writer. That's why I love talking to people virtually. So nice to be with you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. It was great to see. Um, Tell me this. I mean, when we talk about fire in the belly, what does fire in the belly mean to you?
Well, I think it's a sense. It's just absolutely a sense, like intuition is a sense. I think it's a sense of urgency. It's a sense of being compelled. It's a sense of needing. It's absolutely a need that needs to be satisfied. So when I thought of and I of course love Fire in the Belly. I love this name of this show. I thought of it as almost like a dissatisfaction. It's a sense that I have of not being satisfied. And whether that's because I need to go find out everything about something, or, I went back to school late in life. I got a master's degree because of all this stuff that had been happening to me. I got a master's degree and graduated when I was 60. like unheard of. Good thing I did it then, because the memory is, like it's plasticity is, I don't know, it's diminishing. But to your point, when I got into school, for example, like I absolutely had a fire in my belly that I had to make everything of this opportunity. I had to learn everything I could, and I had to deliver of myself everything. I had to put it all out there in my papers, in my thinking, in my research. And so, same thing when I wrote my book. I just put it all out there. And so I think it's that need. Sometimes it's a need to acquire. Sometimes it's a sense of urgency to have, to be curious, to satisfy that. And sometimes it's a need to get it out. So it seems to work in both an ebb and a flow. It's just a sense of urgency, either way.
That's interesting. I mean, where does the where does the panic come from? Not the panic, or where does that come from? Because some people would say it's actually a calming, but you've seen a very different view. And
Well,
you're striving to get somewhere. Is that right?
oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that we're all built differently. We're all constructed completely differently, and my psychology is one of always needing to prove myself. And other people, and certainly New Age people, would say, "But you're enough. You're completely enough as you are, and there's nothing you should be calm and secure with all of that." And for me, that's just nonsense, because I I am not. I'm not that person. Whether that comes from, having been in an orphanage for a couple of years, the first 2 years of my life almost, and maybe I wondered, maybe I felt when I came to America and settled in with this beautiful American couple, maybe I always felt I needed to prove myself to them. But I think moreover, there's something that just gets unleashed, right? Like, okay, I'm out now. I'm out of confinement. I mean, you can't tell me that a toddler doesn't know they're in confinement. They do. I did. And or I had that sense of that. There's a lot of twists to that part of the story too, but yeah, no, I'm not satisfied. And I think the fire in the belly is it's not necessarily wanting to have more. As I say, sometimes it's wanting to get things out and be expressive. But do I reach a sense of tranquility while I'm in the midst of satisfying it? Yeah, I would say so, because there's kind of a zone that you go in. You know, you go around doing prosaic things, and then you turn to the subject that you've been needlessly procrastinating because you're afraid of where it's going to take you, but it's your main search, whatever that is. And um, you are in the zone. And that is the fire in the belly. And, you get a different level of satisfaction when you're pursuing that thing that's really at the core of you, that is tugging you forward in life. And for me, right now, I've been undertaking a little bit of um, trying to understand really intuition quite a bit since these experiences. So when I research or write about intuition, or when I talk to people about intuition, when I talk to creatives about intuition and learning about it, that's a real fire in my belly right now. Maybe that ebbs and flows when you reach satisfying points or not.
Out of interest, is there a connection, do you think, between intuition and identity?
Absolutely. Um, Absolutely. Because so So intuition, while it resides in our unconscious, that's the way that it plays out, right? We don't know where it comes from. We have a flash of intuition. It's because it resides, neurologically, if you will, but certainly from a physiological point of view, it's in the part of the brain. It originates in the part of the brain that is the unconscious. So we're we're constantly absorbing information data through our senses, and the psyche, the unconscious, is recording everything. What only some of it is conscious or can be put into words or is defined. So the part that remains unconscious, you've got all these impressions, right? But then something, you see something, and you see, you read a passage, you see a painting, or you hear a piece of music, and you say, that's it. I don't know what it is, but that I am completely identifying with that thing at this time. And it's because, supposedly, it's because there's a bunch of unconscious information going on back there that's saying, yes, it's totally identifying. And it couldn't be more individualized. It's completely, it's based on your individual experience and how you're processing things. So yes, it has everything to do with identity. And what's more, I think the reason why it's a great question is that unless we are utilizing our intuition, we have not fully formed our identities.
That's deep. Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
that's cool. I like that. I like that. Yeah. So it is, but I suppose the key then obviously is finding, understanding, finding, and utilizing your intuition. Then thinking from the subconscious mind or the superconscious mind, if you want to go that far.
Yeah, I mean, I spent most of my life becoming an adult believing that I should discount my intuition because I couldn't explain it.
Hmm.
The problem with intelligent people is that they're too smart for their own good. So when an intuitive warning comes, or an intuitive, sometimes it's a warning. It's like, if something's bad is going to happen. No, I don't have any reason to think that. I'm going down that trail. And if you're going to wait for reasons, you're still cut off from a whole part of yourself that knows more than you do and is willing to share with you all of this good information, but you have to let it in. And I think, I mean, I was really well, I was much farther along than I should have been, I think, before I started listening to my intuition. Once you hear that voice and you start being aided by it. So intuition comes from the Greek, and it means, to watch over, to protect. So intuition is a form of protection. It's a form of guidance that's offered by your psyche. And, most of us stay completely shut off because it's not a proven, it's not rational. And when it comes down to it, we need both. We need both kinds of information to function.
You described your intuition as a voice.
Hmm.
Do you know whose voice that is, or do you recognize the voice?
Um, well, I think that's deep. It is my voice. To be honest with you, I'd love to say it was someone else's, and maybe let me think. Because there are times, my biological mother, from whom I was separated, I was in the orphanage for the first year and a half of my life, but as it turns out, unbeknownst to me growing up and until I went through this whole experience of learning my biological parentage, she was with me in the orphanage. She took a job in the orphanage to be with me as a young single mother. And at the orphanage, was it was a Germany, so it's called a Kinderheim, like a home for children. And so she was there working. And sometimes I do think I hear her voice. I do, I mean, and I obviously also hear my adoptive mother's voice, but it's my mother's voice. It's that voice saying, you don't need another t-shirt when you've already got, like three. So that's the different voice. This voice is much more inner. Um, I do think it's my own voice, like the voice that I hear right now is pretty much the voice in my head. Um, but I have discounted it any number of times, and much to my peril. Um, I'll tell you a quick incident. In the 1990s, I worked for the Solomon or Guggenheim Museum in New York, and I lived on the same street in Manhattan, which was East 89th Street. So the the Guggenheim faces Central Park. It's on Fifth Avenue at 89th Street. So I was I had been working very late. We often worked late because we had a lot of international relations going on, not just the museum that is in Venice, but also we were developing the museum in Bilbao, Spain, and our architect, Frank Gehry, was in Santa Monica, California. So we were spanning a number of time zones. And so we would work late. We would get to the office and do all of the European work. And then in the evening, we'd go be talking to the California end to keep everything, meshed during this, what I think is a wonderful architectural project in Bilbao. And in any case, I remember walking home from work on East 89th Street. I had a car, and the car, in New York, you have to move your car around. This must have been early 90s. And I was walking home. It must have been close to, say, 11 o'clock at night. And I was walking down 89th Street. I saw my car, and I thought, suddenly in my head came this jump in the car, get in the car and drive away. And I thought to myself, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's 11 o'clock. I'm bushed. I really need to, get home and get some rest. And yes, in the following morning, I think it was to be a long weekend or like a 3-day weekend. And I was meant to get in the car and drive to Vermont. I was going up to New England for I think a fall weekend. And so of course I didn't get in the car. And I got up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed the next morning and walked to where my car had been and saw this gaping parking space where my car had been the night before. It had been stolen. I mean, I could see the other cars that were there that I kind of remembered. So my car wasn't there anymore, and my car had been stolen. It would be almost a year later that the sort of wrecked heap of my car was found, somewhere up along the Hudson somewhere, and had been driven into like a craze by some kids, I guess, that wanted to steal a car. So anyway, that was really a weird experience, because it wouldn't have been weird if it had just been a surprise. Then it's just a big bummer. You come out, your car's not there. But as it was, I knew that I should have gotten in the car. And I don't know what that would have meant. I mean, it would have meant 10 cups of coffee. I was going to drive to Vermont in the middle of the night, or, but I did know it, Pete. And that was one of the first times where I thought to myself, uh-oh, there's like a channel that's coming on that I keep turning it off. But I have to listen to that.
Interesting. You use the word knowing there. Are knowing and intuition the same for you?
Well, I mean, I think, you have to accept it and not reject it and not keep pushing it aside. Again, I think that intelligent people just have a harder time with it because, we're used to having explanations. We're used to using our rational brain. So when something completely counterintuitive or, that means more like what would be expected happens. I've now used my intuition a great deal, and I found myself avoiding you know huge accident scenes. I go around and I'll say, oh, I just had a funny feeling. I drove around, and then, yeah, the sirens, or it's the whole, and the thing is, I'm not alone in this. This is not like I have some special brand of ESP. I really believe that everyone has intuition. And everyone is, I mean, a lot of people who are maybe more comfortable with themselves have been able to access their intuition all along. They, look at me and say like, yeah, like we've been hip to this for a long time. But some of us just don't let it in. And to say, like, I knew it. I always hear people say, I knew I shouldn't have done that. I knew I had an inkling that I should have gone the other way, that I should have taken the other job, and that I should have done this. Um, but the good thing about listening to your intuition is that you don't have those misgivings anymore. And the way that you're listening is that you're not backtracking anymore and second guessing yourselves because everything feels right.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's sort of a moment of alignment almost that you don't have. Would you? Sorry, we're going down a completely different path than I expected here, but that's cool.
Yeah.
Uh, um, would you have a sort of an active voice in your head, as in critical side, or you talk about the knowing and the voice and things like that. How do you get on in your own head?
Well, I love the word alignment that you used. We should only be so lucky to have aligned voices. I mean, I think pretty realistically, there's a conversation going on nearly all the time. I mean, there is always, I'm a very um, practical, pragmatic, and kind of responsible person, which certainly doesn't explain how I took 3 years out of my life to write a book and then went back to school at a late age. But you know, um, I needed to do those things too, in addition to all the very responsible things I did earlier on. I I know that I've started to really realize. It is a voice, Pete, and it's a voice um, that now that I've started listening to it has told me so much. The other day, I was thinking about my mother. It was Mother's Day here in the United States, and um, I was thinking about the words deeply joyous, deeply joyous. That was describing my mother, my adoptive mother, who really is a very social person, a person who really connects with people. I, by comparison, am somewhat more solitary, although you know, my friends would laugh because it's the party is over and I'm still sitting there. But I just think that voice, like just allowing myself to hear words that I wouldn't have necessarily associated with my mother, but then when I realized myself saying it, it was also, I felt such a compulsion to make my mother happy and to set aside my own feelings a lot of the time in order that she um, have what she needed and wanted and kind of facilitated, right? I was like an only child. Here I was, this adopted kid. I was thankful, that I found a family. And, if I didn't let myself like hear words that I don't normally say, like about my mother, I wouldn't have remembered, oh yeah, I think of her that way because and I also set my own role in the family and also with my dad to be a helper, to be a helpmate, to be somebody that made things happen. So while she was enjoying herself, like I would just keep trying to make sure that all the guests in the living room, like had napkins or, I was always making things happen. Um, and that practical, responsible person definitely has a voice now too. But it's different when you can identify them. It's different when you can identify the voices because before it seemed like, oh, that's it. That's the only voice. And it's like, no, wait a minute. How do I really feel? If I stop and check in with myself, How do I really feel? Or what would my intuition say if I slowed down a minute here, or took a walk, or didn't just rush into this situation, but actually took my time with it? So I think there's multiple voices, and I think that they have different kinds of time associated with them. One is a kind of reflexive voice, another is a more processed analytical voice, another can be just a more intuitive voice that you wouldn't hear unless you were out in nature, or, you know, they all seem to have different frequencies or wavelengths.
Wow, that's really strong. That's very, very interesting. And do you, I mean, just out of interest, what's your earliest conscious memory then? And do you have an earlier subconscious memory that you know of?
Well, it's much easier for me to answer the second part of the question first. Um, when we were kids, that our parents, my adoptive parents, my parents, they always made these movies of us, of me, the three of us. So, I mean, I have this film, which I saw over and over, of my maternal grandmother, my adoptive mother's mother, descending from the Lufthansa plane. In those days, they were on the tarmac, and they were big yellow planes from Lufthansa. And my grandmother had me in her arms. She flew to Germany to get me from the orphanage. And she got to the terminal, and there were my parents standing, and she handed me to my mother, which is kind of backwards, when you think about it in terms of generations. Anyway, because I've seen that film so many times, I somehow think that's like my first conscious memory. But I'm sort of here to tell you that I think those things get conflated. That's a memory that was imparted by the film. I would say my first really conscious memory was maybe a year or two later, because I was really only like 2 years old. So, like, it was later than that I remember having my first dog, Pippi, and being on the floor, and being on the floor with Pippi, and playing and stroking and seeing her big, big eyes, and just that sort of more sensorial kind of impression. But speaking of sensory impressions, my earliest pre-conscious memory, and I've only been able to trace this and verify it because of the fact that I did meet my biological mother's family. I mentioned that she was with me in the orphanage, and they say that your olfactory nerve is in the most reptilian part of your brain. So your sense of smell, it's why it triggers so many memories when you smell, the pot of soup, or when you smell the perfume, or you smell the gasoline from the outboard engine, or, whatever it is. And I had no conscious memory of my biological mother, yet she was there. And when I could finally meet her brother, she was deceased, sadly. And when I finally met her brother, I said to him, "Here's what I have as a scent of her. And here's what I think her voice sounded like." And I made a certain sound. And he said, "That is exactly what she sounded like." I mean, it certainly isn't my voice is much lower. It was a very high, like a lilting voice. I didn't have any words because I couldn't remember any words. That was out. And also she'd be speaking German. Um, and I had this scent, this kind of peach blossom scent. And he said, yes, that was her. So, you just never know. I think, these things come back, then they're not in the, cerebral cortex where, where you're allowed, you're allowed free access. I remember a friend of our family's, you're letting me babble here. You must cut me off. I'm terribly anecdotal, but I remember this family friend. She too was German. She was a friend of my parents when we boated on the Chesapeake Bay. We had a small cabin cruiser, and these were friends of my parents he worked with my dad at General Electric, and she was his partner, and she was German, and she worked in a bank in Wilmington, Delaware. Okay. Well, At one point, this poor woman, Larissa, this was decades later, but she was in a terrible car accident and she was hit head on and was neurologically impaired. And when we were asked to come to the hospital to see her, she was still in a coma and had been for 40 some days. So they were, the doctors were quite concerned that she wasn't going to emerge. And she'd not had any recognition of her husband. Um, and they were having a really hard time, like, getting contact with her. And anyway, I was standing by her bed and she was murmuring. She was making sounds, Larissa. And I recognized it from my high school French class as being French. She was speaking French. So, of course, she was German, but we were in America, so there was no explanation. But anyway, I just looked up and I said to her husband, she's speaking French. I can tell you what she just said. And I translated it. And he, like, his jaw dropped and he said, she spent time in France because during the Second World War, her parents took her out and they traveled across France to get to America. And she spent a certain amount of time in France, like while she was an infant, like, or a toddler. So, and now, of course, I have to go home and I've got to look through my Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever we used those days. I mean, to learn that memory is like spiral bound in your cortex. And so what happens, she suffered a traumatic brain injury. She did recover, by the way, not fully, but mostly. She, she regressed, and she regressed to this point in the memory where she was speaking French. And so things are stored in places that we can't get to unless you have this, horrific jolt, literally. And, trauma is like that. I do think that trauma and intuition are also quite closely linked. But those were my memories.
Hmm. Interesting, yeah, and as you say, the link between trauma, it seems that trauma brings you into a point in your memories, intuition, whatever it is, for whatever reason, to just drops you into a strange place. You say, for, speaking French and things like that, that's bizarre. But to take us right back, so you were born in Germany, I take it then, were you?
Yes, I was born in Stuttgart, Germany. And the irony is that my adoptive family, my mother's side, her mother was also German, and she also came from Stuttgart. So everybody, there was this kind of convergence to this place. Um, Before we leave the subject of trauma and intuition, I might just mention too, um, I had to delve into all of this because I had to understand it for myself. So when you're severed from your biological parent, your mother, there is a trauma, and that trauma, you would of course believe it if you even watched an infant being left in a room for 10 minutes when their mother left the room. I mean, it's traumatic. So if the mother leaves permanently, that is a trauma. Um, and when a trauma is sustained, that turns off the left brain um, thinking, because that's where logic resides, right? But trauma is something that can't be processed. So your left brain turns off and you get almost exclusively into right brain thinking, which is very intuitive, very creative, emotional. There's imagery. It's not linear. So that's basically what happens with a lot of us that have early traumas. We end up being very intuitive as a result. We're being offered protection as a result. It's the whole physiology saying, I don't want this to happen to you again. Sometimes we become like hyper vigilant, and in hypervigilance become like so intuitive that we just almost sense everything, um, which can be difficult when you're just trying to go through the grocery line and like not pick up all the vibes from everybody, especially now in COVID. COVID-19. But so there is a transfer over to the right brain, and some dysregulation emotionally. But because I was trying so hard to be like a good kid, to be worthy of being adopted and to prove myself. I was always, on the left brain, excelling at school, feeling I needed to do those things. And maybe that was a kind of fire in the belly, or maybe that was a kind of compulsion. It wouldn't be until later, when I did link up with my intuition, that I would really understand the things that gave me the fire in the belly, that were out of, not like neurotic reasons, things that just drew me magnetically to them. So yes, I was born in Stuttgart. My adoptive mother's family is there. Um, it's such a convoluted story, but I do go back there primarily because, as it turns out, this biological father that I mentioned at the beginning of your show, he is Swiss. So my biological mom was German, and my biological father is Swiss, and he is from Zurich. So he called me, or he sent me a letter, and it came to my adoptive mom's home where I grew up. And strangely, my adoptive father, my beloved adoptive father, had just died. This was 2002. My dad died in February of 2002. He's the one that taught me how to navigate a boat, and um, we had great times together. Um, so he died in February 2002, and in September of 2002, I got the letter from my biological father, Otto. So it was 6 months apart.
Was that coincidence?
You know, I tried a lot of different ways to say that that was coincidental, like that was just some kind of random circumstance. But it's an excellent question, because others have said to me it had to do with there no longer being, um, much as I love my dad, that maybe there was a certain controlling presence there in terms of wanting to keep this kind of information out. And the thing is that, but the gateway opened fantastically. As you say, with COVID, there's silver linings to everything. Here, my poor dad had just died, a long suffering illness, so it was really a blessing. But you know, my mother, my adoptive mother, then just said, "Well, I give up." We looked at this letter. It had the social services seal, like international adoptions were handled through this agency, and we just looked at it, and it was like glowing. We just knew it had to do with something of my past history. And here it was in our living room. My dad was gone, and my mother just didn't care anymore, because she said, nothing matters anymore. Your dad is gone, and that was her Rock of Gibraltar. So, you know, and that's my Artie, the dachshund, in case anyone's wondering. But we had this letter, and it was like neutronic. It was definitely, we hadn't opened it, and it was definitely from, and it turned out it was, and I also knew, actually, of course I knew, when I opened the letter, I felt it was masculine. It was a masculine kind of presence. It wasn't directly from my father. It was from the social services agency, but it was so mechanized and so strategic that I thought to myself, this is a man. This is not, I've been dying to meet you, I just want to know you. No, it was all of this circumlocution. And of course, I've learned that, the Swiss are quite formal people, so it's consistent with that. But as a result of meeting him, Otto, in the book, and then going to Switzerland, I was then back in proximity to Stuttgart, right? That's only a couple-hour drive. So I got to see some of my mom's family, cousins and aunts that I'd always known periodically growing up, because they'd visit us, or vice. well, I hadn't been there, but since I was born. But anyway, I got to visit them again, and it's been lovely. And it's just great having all of these parts of my family known. Really, that's just been fantastic, coming full circle.
Interesting there. You talked about, and even circling back to the start, you talked about identity and then even trauma. Can I just ask, with your trauma, was that an accurate picture? Is that trauma something you had to go back and to revisit over the years? Was it?
Absolutely, it's something that requires a lot of work, and the reason being, I really appreciate the sensitive question. The reason being is that you can think, hey, this is just the way I am, I'm just this way. But unless you identify your trauma, you don't understand that that threat of being abandoned and that fear of being abandoned can like operationalize your whole life. Your relationships in particular are impacted by early abandonment. And I mean, no, my mother did not abandon me, really. She left me in the care of very good caregivers. But, a child is going to interpret this as abandonment. So um, I think that fear of abandonment, one of the things that happens when you lose love and you have a great loss is that you don't invest yourself in love again very easily. And I think that was very present, that I stayed very much on the sidelines of emotional involvement for a long time. Growing up, I became absorbed scholastically. I could sort of see myself with people, but I wasn't fully with people when I started having boyfriends. And then, of course, I chose the one boyfriend that my parents would despise and got like cut out of our family because of it. And, there was a lot of acting out. And I think the other thing that happens is there's a lot of, boundary testing. Like, I need to know, like, do these people really love me? And so, you push, and you just have to get to them. You have to get them to say, "Oh no, don't worry, I love you, and it will be all right, and we'll always be together." And that these assurances that most people just automatically have. Like a lot of my friends that are friends with me say, "Of course we're going to be friends forever. Why wouldn't we be friends forever?" Well, if you have my kind of mind, like something could happen next Thursday and you'd say, no, you're not a part of my life anymore. Those, and I really needed to identify that. I needed to say, I own that I claim. It's not the other people. It's not the way I am. It's a factor that comes from this experience. And I think that really allowing yourself to be vulnerable, and that's one step. And the other part of healing that I think is even harder is the idea of regulating yourself emotionally, because if you are, I ended up being very creative and intuitive and had a career, certainly in the sort of leadership part of the art world. Not, I wasn't an artist, but anyway, I do think that one of the things that happens, your amygdala is the gland at the base of your cranium that is the regulator of your emotions. So it's the one that kicks in when it's time to say, wait a minute, stand back, have a look at this. It's not what you think. Don't get carried away, and sort of get perspective. But when you've gone through trauma, whether it's adoption, abandonment, severance, or other kinds of trauma, your amygdala gets dysregulated. So you're reactive, you're overreactive. And so I was overreactive. And I thought that these carrying ons and these, kind of getting so excited and worked up over things. I was totally entitled to do that. Well, not really. Not if you want to kind of join the human race. You have to kind of rein it in and create a balance in yourself where, some part of you is saying, really? You're that upset about that? In the larger scheme of things, is it important? Um, and I think one of the other things that even comes into my definition of fire in the belly when I was thinking about it is the sense of obsession. Obsession was also part of my psyche, I think, and being obsessed, especially being obsessed with things that clearly I couldn't have. If you have this, you have a ghost of a ghost of a biological parent and a phantom biological mother. You can never have those people. They're just out of reach. Um, you become kind of obsessed with them, and that the dyad of obsession is compulsion. So you can get very compulsive, and like all of these things feel totally like, quote, natural until you take a good hard look at yourself and say, wait a minute, hang on. I mean, how's this going to function inside a family where you have to take other people's needs into consideration, and you're in a partnership where, I have now to realize someone else's needs as being as important as my own, even if they don't feel as gravely compulsive to me, but I have to pause, hit pause, put myself in that person's shoes and really feel it. And that's something that's taken time.
Am I right in saying, I mean, it sounds like, or it feels like your voids were your values for quite some time?
Well, I think by default that's absolutely correct. You don't realize them as voids. And it's that strange way in which we, unless we do, we can feel like our reality is reality. you know, it's it's just it's just not. And to be honest, one of the reasons that I'm very glad of writing the book is not just because I did get it out there, and many of my thoughts and emotions are right there on the page, but also because um, they're they are out there, flawed or not flawed. I like the fact that I took the risk of putting them out there, even if somebody says, well, that's crazy. Um, I think your values are your voids too when you don't allow any feedback. There's no feedback loop. You're just sort of self-contained or self-absorbed, or, going about your world and busy, 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 and not, you know, taking the risk of putting yourself out there to hear somebody say, well, yeah, but what about this? Did you ever stop to think, how your mother might have felt, or how your father might have felt, or how your biological father might have felt? Why did he wait 47 years to get in touch with me? There was a lot of, I was like, I think I'm angry about this. No, I'm not angry. I'm very welcoming and grateful of it. And then, there's these duels that go on. And so I was angry about the fact that he never came clean with the truth. And I had to go about my own, intrigue and, sort of investigation. um, it's like, it was like, wait, here, hang on. I think it's on the back of the book. It's like one part, yeah, this was written by my publisher, one part forensic investigation, one part self-discovery. I mean, I had to go through a lot of different competing versions of my story to find out the truth. So I did have a lot of different reactions to it. But, good that I got them out there and that I could see them for what they are, and other people can see them for what they are. And I feel like, oh, good, I joined the human race.
Well, just tell me, change it up a wee bit. I mean, 7-year-old Diane, what would we have seen?
Well, I mean, needless to say, I was darling, but no, I mean, let's see, 7. That was probably like, actually, that was a really that was a good time. Um, Loved being a tomboy, loved running around with my dog. And yeah, by then my dad, who was an aeronautics engineer, so he designed space capsules for they were putting manned satellites into space in the 1960s, and so he was an engineer, and I would be down in the basement at age 7 helping him make like a dinghy for our boat so that we could row the dog ashore. Clearly, you could go to the marine store and buy a dinghy, but no, we had to build the dinghy from scratch with the steaming the beams and layering over the fiberglass and making this thing together. I mean, that was we were down there the better part of a whole winter making that thing. When I think about the noxious fumes that we inhaled, it's really quite a wonder that we're even coherent at this point. But that's what I did when I was 7. I would help my dad with projects. I did not really identify as a super frilly girl, um, but I did, I was already in grade school. I had this amazingly attractive, like first grade teacher, Miss Shane, and she was so feminine. I thought, well, maybe I should get on board with this. And like wearing skirts, her hair was actually done. I mean, literally, I was this kid running around, on my bike, on my skateboard, in the dirt, playing kickball or helping my dad with the projects, running around with my dog, jumping off the boat into the water, swimming underwater with my parents' friend who would swim me underneath the boat. I mean, this kind of thing really, like, this was my excitement. Then I got to school and I realized, oh yeah, you're supposed to try to be pretty and do stuff like a girl. So I did kind of. My mother was extremely feminine, and shortly thereafter, I would have been about maybe 8 or 9, she had me start to be a model, a child model. Um, and that was kind of weird because again, I wasn't quite that kind of little girl. But I used to model for the Sears Roebuck catalog. And, but I think what you're saying, like 7, that was just before then. That was when I was still like free.
Wow, okay. It's interesting. And how was school for you? Was that something you enjoyed or?
Well, again, I mean, I felt extremely like I had to do well at school. I was completely curious about everything, so in that sense, it was natural. But that whole business of sitting in a classroom when it's nice outside, that like doesn't work for me even now. I'm not sure about, now that we're in COVID-19 and so many of my neighbors have their children at home, it just all looks so much healthier. Forgive me because I know we're going through a tragic time. There's a great loss of life. There's a great loss of economic fluidity, and there's a substantial setback. But when I look at the kids next door being able to study on the computer with their mom, their lessons are there, and then hop into the little boat and go buzzing around or go on their paddle board, and that somehow there's a lot more balance to that. So what you're saying, the first part of it is I did really well at school. I was totally interested and absorbed by everything, but I did bemoan the fact that I felt completely constricted and, into adolescence, pretty resentful over the amount of just time of sitting indoors with fluorescent lights and 2,200 other kids. And oh my God, what a disaster. I do think there should be more balance set into
Mm,
children's programs.
yeah, absolutely. Well, through high school there, secondary school, I mean, what was you're coming into sort of adulthood or adolescence, I should say, sorry. You know, did you continue with, enjoying school and what was your main take on the high school part?
Well, it was a bit of a setback to be getting stoned every afternoon with my friends because, that took up a lot of time. And Then we would get enormously hungry and have to have like the munchies for another couple hours. And, it threw off the schedule, but, it really, it never, it's funny. I, I don't know, Pete, how we just took on another role. We were just, we in high school, I became much more of a rebel. I never stopped being interested in school. Thank goodness I was at the very end of the bell curve in terms of the baby boomer generation. Our high school got overfilled. So it was beyond capacity. So I guess the fire marshal wouldn't let us like have high school anymore with the next grade coming when I was going to be a senior. And so the school district acquired this old mansion nearby. And I think like 100 of us, if we signed up, you had to be academically okay. Um, but if the first 100 kids to sign up, we're going to be able to go to this place. And the name of the the name of the estate, funnily enough, was All Gates Estate. And it was from the Gates family in sort of Havertown, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. And so we went to All Gates. This was like a house that we had our English poetry classes and literature classes out in the gazebo on the lawn on nice days. We didn't have a gymnasium, so this local yoga teacher came in and started teaching us, Grace Stern. She was fantastic. We were all completely lithe, supple, flexible. Really, I don't remember ever looking as well as that year of having yoga, 3 times a day or 3 times a week, I mean. And, we learned like meditation, and there was a greenhouse on the estate. So our biology teacher, we were planting things. He took us on these hikes along the Appalachian Trail for weeks at a time and got them approved as school projects. I mean, it was really much more enlightened in that way than anything that had happened before. And it happened just in the nick of time because, as I say, it was like the early 70s. I was wearing my armband to protest the war in Vietnam. I was against a lot of authoritarian kinds of things. And in this monstrous high school, we had way too many rules, dress codes, everything. I was always violating those. And I was also the editor of the school newspaper. So, when I wasn't getting chafed at with, having some infraction, I was writing editorials about, how the no good, obviously there was, the generation, there was, you couldn't trust anybody over 30, so, I mean, you write all these like, editorials about how we should be allowed to, wear what we want, and it's on the inside that counts, and who are they, to keep our hair short, and guys had to have short hair, and oh my gosh. Anyway, it was those times. We were all fighting, and I was fighting along with.
Wow. What was the newspaper called?
The Fortean. See, because I went to school in Haverford Township, PA, and it was Haverford High School. So, it's that kind of rah-rah thing, right? The Fortean. And it was lovely because the predecessor, I was a reporter in my junior year, and the predecessor, the editor that year, and like the editor in chief, and then the editorial manager, they were both seniors, and they became friends of my best friend Ellen and I, and that's who we were getting stoned with. So we got stoned with the editors, and then we'd all be talking about story ideas and wow, and this and that, and our visions for world peace. And finally the editor said, I'm going to make you the editor next year. I'm like, oh God, how am I going to do that? And, eat a box of Girl Scout cookies at the same time. I mean, I do remember actually sitting in the newspaper offices, eating all these cookies because it's not like we were stoners. We were going to class and we were doing well. We were all in the honors, we had honors society and all of that. But we had to do something, and it was great. Woodstock was happening. What we were supposed to do, like look the other way and say, oh no, that's not for me. No, no, no. We were a part of it. It was our time.
Do you still have any of your articles from that time?
Oh dear. I have a feeling I do. It's in deep storage, but because of the generations, I've just sadly, she's okay. She's okay. My adoptive mom is okay, but she is 90 years old, and so now she's moved into assisted living, and so far so good on remaining healthy in the COVID virus. I have, as a result, cleared out her house, and it no longer belongs in the family, and new couple has it, and I'm only too glad of it. But I've got the contents of her files from my tiniest years, and I'm sure the Fortean articles are in there somewhere. So probably the answer is yes.
So deeply stored in your mind and deeply stored in the cabinet somewhere. But
Right,
yeah.
right. It's a good metaphor.
So tell me then. So you did. What was after school then? What did you go to?
Well, as I mentioned, I had this boyfriend that was not acceptable to my parents. And so I left my parents' house when I was 18 years old. And I moved in with that boyfriend in the country, out in the country, in the suburbs of Pennsylvania. And, to this day, I love the country. And when I learned about my biological heritage, because there was no real precedent for this in my suburban family, I learned a couple things. One, when I found my roots, that my biological mother, when I was 13, just going into adolescence, and I told my mom, "Hey, look, I want to sew my clothes. I want to get sewing lessons, and I want to make my own clothes." And she's like, "Okay, sure, but we can go to the department store. I can buy you a dress." And, we were fortunate that way. But I said, "No, no, I want to make my things." So I did take sewing lessons, and only to find out like 50 years later that, a little less, 40 years later, that or less. But anyway, somehow I've gotten to this point where I think I'm so old. Apparently I'm not. I've still got plenty of fire in the belly. Thank you very much. But anyway, I found out my mom was a seamstress. My biological mom had been a seamstress, and her family did. There was an ebb and flow of their monetary resources. At the point where I was born, they were, quite impoverished, but that was characteristic of post-war Germany. But at times they had land, they were landholders. And similarly, on the other side, my biological father, his parents were farmers and his grandparents had been farmers. And when I met him, we used to go to lunch at this vegetarian restaurant. He's passed on since then. But that restaurant had been supplied by his parents' farm. So when I got out to the country where this next boyfriend lived, I just suddenly felt like completely at home. I had this garden that grew all the onions and potatoes and beans, and walked and walked and walked. I don't know, in some ways it was like a new freedom. It was just a newfound freedom. I felt very glad of being out of school, out of confinement, out of a rather strict, I would say, overprotective environment with my parents. So I didn't go to college then. I worked for a couple of years, and I worked in a real estate office. I got my real estate license. There were things that were happening in the relationship that weren't. But I was young. I hadn't been to school, university, so long story short, I kind of, having not spoken to my family in 2 years, of course, my father maintained covert conversations with me by phone during this time from his office at General Electric. Some of my German family, my uncle was corresponding with me, and it's just lovely to not be excommunicated completely. And I returned to the fold. Like when I was 22, I came back to my parents' house. I left the farm. I went back. I became very respectable. I started working, but then not long afterwards, I decided to go back to university. And by then, my contemporaries were gone. They graduated. So I went, when everyone was leaving, I was going in, and I went through university in like 3 years flat, going straight through the summers and going into the honors program. So my thirst for knowledge hadn't left me. But I just found out another side of myself, that I still do love being in the country, and country life quite suited me. there are times now when I think I'd like to enjoy that again. But so that's what I did in my early 20s. Went back to university at Villanova University and had a great time of it. And then went right back to work afterwards. And um,
What did you study? What was your chosen subject?
well, so the honors program was this mixed bag of academics, but it was liberal arts. Was It was under the rubric of the liberal arts university, and had been taking a night school. I had been taking some night classes because, of course, by then I was 24. I was like, can I even still learn? Am I even going to be able to do college? And so I went to night school to kind of put my toe in the water. And I remember being in this philosophy class. I went Villanova University is a Jesuit college, so they have a very strong like Greek and classics and philosophy department. So this professor asked this question in class, um, something totally outlandish and ethereal. Is the world contained in the universe? Or that I would have been able to answer from my dad's aerospace, always teaching me about the skies. But it was some other kind of metaphysical question. What is contained in this? Are we contained in the world, or is the world contained in us? Something like that. And I was like, both. I think it's both. I raised my hand. It's both. What have I got to lose? I've been, working in a real estate office for 2 years. So, I was like, I don't even think I belong here. I was like, I think it's both. The professor is like very dignified, Greek professor, right? Totally. Oh, like Theophilus, I can't remember his name, very handsome and had a Greek typewriter. I remember that. Anyway, called me. He said, could you stay after class? Could you see me after class? I'm thinking, oh God, here it goes. I'm going to be kicked out of the one class that I'm taking, trying to get back to university. And he said, I like, are you thinking of coming back to school? Because I think you should. And I said, yes, I am. I'd like to come full time. He said, good. I'm going to introduce you to the director, the head of the honors department. I think you belong in the honors program. No, you don't understand. I've been a hippie for 2 years. Then I've been like working in a real estate office. I know nothing. He's like, yes, you do. You have just the kind of mind. And the honors program was this interdisciplinary program. So what happened is you got in the classroom, you took a certain period of history, like say late 19th century, and there would be like 3 to 4 professors in the class at the same time. All the students, there were only like 36 of us in the whole program. And the professors would teach that period from the point of view of science, sociology, literature, and how those things related to one another. And it was totally fascinating. What was not to like about that? It was just the greatest. I couldn't get
Well,
enough of it.
that's great. It's great exposure and great for the mindset too, and stretching back. Did you learn much about yourself, do you think?
Not enough, actually. I think I was really caught up in the swirl to the point where as I say, I felt a little disconnected still. I didn't identify passions in myself. Like I had a complete fluency with art. I took an art history course during that time. When I was studying the arts of a period, like they'd run through the slides. I could identify every slide, every artist, no problem. Didn't need labels. The Barnes Foundation was a museum nearby us, and I went like 20 times. I had the whole collection and the whole place memorized. Albert Barnes never had wall texts on any of his. It was mostly an impressionist collection, and I was drawn to it. But I didn't know enough about myself, Pete. So I really didn't know about myself. Like I think I could have dedicated myself right then and there to being in the arts, and maybe I would have become a curator. Maybe I would have, as it was, it took me a whole nother decade to get to the Guggenheim Museum. And, I kept kind of ambling around. I didn't hear the messages. I didn't hear, you know, I love this. I'm sure I was saying it. But I just didn't trust it enough to go on it. So I dithered around. I've always worked, worked again in real estate and worked for this enormous real estate company again after I graduated from school, thinking, oh, well, those were just silly passions and interests and culture. That's not something you can really rely upon for your job. I have to get like a serious job. So, it would be like a whole nother decade before I said, no, I love that. I love that environment. I love those people. That's where I belong.
Wow. So you came out of college then, and did you saying you had sort of real estate job was still on the go there, but obviously the Guggenheim was that a goal for you, or was that something you worked up to?
Well, it was kind of haphazard because because I had a real estate background. Then when I graduated college, I became like an office manager in a commercial real estate firm, but nationwide firm. And there, a couple years into that, maybe 3 or 4 years into that, I met my future husband who worked for a developer. And let's see, some guys had branched off from our company and were going into business for themselves. They wanted me to come along with them in their development. They were doing office building development. And I, was in love. I was in love with my first husband. And um, didn't, I wanted to try to have everything, have it all like everyone does, but it was going to be a competitor. He worked for a competitor. And I chose him. I chose to be with my husband. And he said, look, if there's anything you want to go back to school for, when we are living together, then maybe that will afford you the chance to go back to school. And right away, I went back to art school. I went to art school in Philadelphia and studied design. And just when I was getting a certificate in that, we were actually married. The marriage did not last, and that was entirely due to my just pushing the boundaries. I mean, I really imploded that marriage. It was a practice marriage, is what people tell me now, I think, to make me feel better. But it was a 3-year marriage, and I was 30. It's like 30 to 33 or so, or 33 to 36. I was in my early 30s. Um, and I really hadn't grown inside as a person. I didn't understand that my word was my bond. I didn't trust myself. But there I was, and I had the certificate from the Art Institute in Philadelphia. And that set me on a new course. And so I was interviewing, I had this idea that I could somehow, as many people who go through a divorce do, if I change my location, then I can create my life. I can create a new life. My parents and my former husband and all of that life and my schooling, all of that had taken place in suburban Philadelphia. So I wanted to change. So I was interviewing in New York for a real estate developer there in the design firm, since I'd studied design. And then at the very last minute, I had the offer in hand. And at the very last minute, I got this phone call. You don't know me. I'm the director of personnel at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. I think you'd really like it here. I've got a position that I think you'd really enjoy. Thinking to myself, I've never worked in a museum before. I know not the. Then I started to remember the slides, the art history class. Well, I mean, it just sounds a little bit more interesting than office buildings. So I'll ask these people for 24 hours. I'll come on the interview and we'll see what happens. And I met Tom Kranz, who was the director at the Guggenheim, quite a visionary, quite a genius. And I met him in 1990. And I said, so what's the job? And he said, well, anything you want it to be. I said, okay, I'll take it. And so, it really was quite a fun ride, that journey for the next, I don't know, it was sort of the next 8 years. There was a little interval there where I took a sabbatical because we were traveling quite a bit for the museum. But there was a bit of a burnout, and I went to Vermont. I went to the country and chilled out for a while. Same director of personnel came up on a little ski trip to Vermont and said, hey, your position's open and there's an apartment with it. You want to come back? I'm like, yeah, I do. So I did. So there was 2 distinct times in the 1990s where I worked as an administrative um, in the administrative office at the director's office at the Guggenheim. And it was quite a wonderful time, very expensive. And as I say, Tom was a visionary, and I don't think we'll see the likes of that again. It feels very painful right now what's happening with museums contracting and trying to figure out how to have in-person experiences digitally. And it's going to be um, a game changer, I think, with this pandemic.
Yeah, it's very much a different time, I suppose, in museums in general. So, but you were saying on and off there, you had was about an 8 year spell, all in all.
Yes, and at the end of it, I was offered a position in the museum to be in, I could become a director of development or an assistant director of development, which was, it was a promotion. That was a good thing, right? You've got a business card but development, like everybody knows that means you're asking for money. And I just didn't have that gear, even though through some of my associations, I'd pulled people toward the museum that I met, and I brought them into the orbit a little bit closer to Tom and all of our plans and renovating the Frank Lloyd Wright building, that is the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And, it was really exciting to have those people that I had met. Sometimes it was just a matter of, I would go seek them out at an opening and say, look, I know you've been trying to get in touch with my boss for months now, and I'm his assistant. I'm here to say hello, and I'm sorry it's so busy. But, let me hear what you'd like to do. And, so I did pave the way then for some serious development that went on at the Guggenheim. One was the renovation of the theater, and there were donors, and so it only made sense that they would offer me a position in the development office. But I just cringed at the idea of this word development on my card, and I couldn't see myself doing it. So I did. I left the Guggenheim ultimately, and I went to work for a collector who had a not-for-profit, and it was helping people. It was helping homeless people um, become job ready. And he had a project in Soho of that cleaned the out of work homeless people would clean the streets for a certain membership fee, like a community membership fee. They published a guide to Soho, and then he had this fantastic collection that I introduced him to the Guggenheim, and then somehow it was just the right ambiance, and I liked doing something that was very constructive. I mean, I reasoned somehow that the art world, it could have this superficial dimension. Of course, it's not. It's a wonderful world to be in, and people need creativity and expression more than ever now. But another aspect of it was that I did have an altruistic feeling of wanting to help people, and I got to do that in those couple years where I was the executive director of this not-for-profit. And then shortly after that, um, I met, I was really relatively relationship free during all this time because, I'd already burned through a marriage. I was scared of getting involved with anyone. AIDS was really happening in New York in the 90s. So it was a really scary proposition to get involved with anyone. But towards the end of the 90s, when there was more hope on the horizon, I did become involved with a man who I thought I was going to marry. It looked like I was going to marry. I had a ring that said I was going to marry, but ultimately it didn't work out. And then 2001 happened with um, um, the 9/11 attacks, and I did head out to the country again, as many New Yorkers did. I had been working in Soho for the partnership, for the not-for-profit, and then 9/11 happened. And, we all scratched our heads then and said, wait a minute, are we where we want to be? Are we with who we want to be with? Are we doing what really is closest to our hearts? It's somewhat the same introspection that's going on now, I think. People have a chance to think now that they're home. But anyway, I spent that time sort of that relationship eventually did fizzle. And I and then I was again out in the country trying to find myself, having kind of a creative country life. A couple years, no, it was around, okay, so it was 2002, right? I came back to the city. I worked for an art gallery again, and that's when the letter from Otto came, from my biological father. So it was a spin. It was a real spinning kind of situation. My world sort of upended, but so I was in New York for that period. That was the beginning of the 2000s. And through Otto, who was Swiss, as I mentioned, um, he had a friend in New York who came to visit me at the art gallery, and she was this Swiss designer. She's very chic. She was the head of something called the Swiss American Society in New York. Who even knew there was such a thing? It was for Swiss professionals living in New York City. And I met her at the gallery, and she looked at me coming down the stairs. We had a gallery in a townhouse. She pointed to me, she just looked at me and she said, "Well, you don't need any DNA tests. I've been friends of Otto's, your biological father, for 35 years, and you are his DNA because you walk alike, you look alike, you're the spitting image." At that time, we hadn't exchanged photographs yet or anything. And then I got to the bottom of the stairs and she said, "And I have someone I want you to meet. Are you single?" And I said, "Yes, but I'm going through this thing of finding or learning about my biological father. And don't you think that's enough to have going on?" She's like, "No, I think you should meet this man. He's in the Swiss American Society." And I said, "Look, let's just put it off for a month or two while I process all of this." And Otto came to New York, and we were together with Erica, this woman, and had this whirlwind 4-day meeting in New York of getting to know one another, going to the Guggenheim, going down to Philadelphia, meeting my mother. Um, but eventually I said yes to this matchmaking, and that is my second husband with whom I live now in St. Petersburg, Florida. And because he is also Swiss by birth, we have traveled back to Switzerland every year. Um, when Otto was alive, it was great for me to really build a relationship with him, a real relationship. And we were close. And up until his death in 2018. And we went cross country skiing together. We, rode bicycles. I don't know. We just walked and talked a lot. And but then I married this man, sure enough, who I was match made with, and now we have a tiny little place in Switzerland, and I still go back there, and I still see my family from Stuttgart and my biological mother's family from northern Germany. So kind of brings tears to my eyes to hear me even say this, what kind of magic it's been for all of this to come together this way.
That's quite something. I mean, and you had obviously that 16-year period as well with Otto. Um, was your biological mother alive at this point?
Here's another thing where I think you could ask, was this coincidental? She had died, sadly, she had died in 1987. Otto clearly knew who she was. So, again, had he waited until she was gone? I mean, it was it's very hard to second guess. But in any case, she'd been gone for a good long while. Um, I wasn't able to meet her as a result, and but I was not sure that Otto was leveling with me about the story. And when he came to meet my mother in Philadelphia, he promptly said, "Well, we thought Diane wasn't my name then. My name was Petra. My birth name was Petra Michelman, and then my parents renamed me for Miss America. If you can think of anything cheesier. I mean, I was named after Miss America the year that I came to America. Anyway, her name was not Diane. It was Leanne Merriweather, but I was named Diane Lee in a compromise from my father, thank goodness. Anyway, this idea that I was shuttled off after like 3 days, and it just didn't resonate. And then, eventually I was reading I got my folder, my adoption folder, and none of it rang true. And there was documents in there that Otto had been paying a stipend for me to be in the orphanage for, those, that year and a half. So, so what really happened? And then he wasn't really upfront about it. This is a generation, he died at age 90. This was not a generation that was known for candor. It was not one that divulged secrets. It was not one that was confessional, or, he wanted me to think the best of him. He didn't want me to think that he deserted my mother and I, and that's exactly what had happened. So anyway, it would be a very long time before I learned that through her siblings, and actually through a letter that I got. Otto was a notorious womanizer. He was prolific almost up until his death. It was quite mind-boggling. So his wife, his long-suffering wife, was also, you can imagine how she was with the news that I existed. I'd been born 15 years prior to them being married, but still, it was another secret that he kept. It was another thing that he was here and she was there, and they didn't, he wasn't open and honest with her. And maybe that was my first tip off, that he wouldn't be honest with me. But so I just had a lot of misgivings, and then it turned out that a woman that he was involved with after he was involved with my biological mother um, had one of the letters that my biological mother had written to Otto, saying, "I'm here in the orphanage with our dear Petra, and she looks just like you. And I just can't wait to be introduced to your parents like you said you would do. And, I hope that won't be long." And I have that letter in her hand. It took place over 3 months, this beseeching letter. And she was quite, affectionate. She said, I kiss our daughter, and I wish you well. And, just hoping that, everything, that you come through with your promises. And I have that letter. So the woman in question sent it directly to me. Never, she bypassed Otto altogether. So then I had to confront him with that, and yeah. So the 16 years was not all it was not all fairy tale wine and roses. I was pretty bent out of shape for one or two of those years. I was ranting and raving at him, and just couldn't understand why he couldn't come clean. But in the end, I did understand. In the end, I understood people are flawed. We're all flawed. Sometimes there's a chamber that won't unlock. He couldn't let me be seen. He couldn't let himself be seen a certain way, and he wanted to be viewed as the knight in shining armor that came through and delivered me from ignorance about my roots. So that was his part of it. I was just very glad to have met my biological mother's family, with whom I have a special bond.
Wow, that's quite something. I mean, you talked about, really at the start, you talked about identity. I mean, through this process, I mean, has that helped you with your identity? Do you feel that you've pieced it all together now?
I feel as though the factual part is pieced together, and that gives me great satisfaction. As to who I am, you know how it is. You look at your relatives and you see yourself either in contrast to them or as kindred to them. I have a kindred feeling with my biological mother's family. I adore Otto's family. I have a half sister and a half brother. Um, it was through no fault of their own that he did what he did, and or that he kept it. Everyone, look, he was 27 years old. He's certainly not the first man to have. I was giving him credit for having supported me in the orphanage. I thought, look, you did great. Everybody does stuff in their 20s. I did stupid stuff. Everybody does stupid stuff. But I think I had to really ask myself, Pete, am I this kind of person Do I want to be the kind of person who creates illusions about themselves and will only let others think the best? Or do I want people to know me, warts and all, for who I am, for my very deep flaws and my unavoidable kind of quirks? And the answer after that, after that 15, 16 years was yes, I want to disclose myself. And that continues to be, as you well know, a voyage. So the identity piece, it's never done. Um, but I have been able to, yes, see, really the great role also that my mother, my adoptive mother and father played. um, no one could possibly ask me, well, is it nature or nurture? We used to have these big behaviorism was very big. You were who you were nurtured by. Well, not exactly, because I did learn cross country skiing when I went to Vermont, and Otto was a cross country skier, and I was making my own clothes, and my mother was a seamstress. So, you know, all my genetic coding was unspooling all along. I didn't know it at the time, but it's all these threads, right? It's a composite, and there are all these threads that go into it. So I'm very heartened by knowing and being able to accept these influences in my life. My adoptive mother has been at the fore of my consciousness for these months this year because of going into assisted living and the generational changes of caring for an elderly parent. But I so see her because one of the last thing that goes, I mean, her memory is quite shot, but her personality is still intact, and her personality is just one that it goes back to, like, there she is. There's the woman I love. There's the woman I loved growing up. I mean, we were very different from one another. We butted heads at times, but I see her now and I see her core, and I just appreciate her in a new way altogether. My dad and I always had this affinity. He taught me science. He helped, I built things with him, and that was kind of a given. It was harder to work all the way around my mother. So I think, it never stops. It never stops evolving. And I'm just very grateful that I have all of these people really in my life. The widow of Otto is a very special person to my husband and I. And, so are my half siblings. And my half sister, I'm the godmother of her son. So um, they're inexplicable, these bonds. Partly their blood, partly their what we've been through, our history, partly their affinity, partly because we need one another to work out the equation of who we are, and they're all a part of who I am. And really, I feel quite a very full heart at this point.
Yeah, it's amazing to see. Out of interest, did you always know you were adopted, or what stage did that come in?
I always knew, and that's on account of this grandmother. She was a real blabbermouth, the one that went to get me on the plane, the Lufthansa plane, the yellow plane. My mother's mother was from the Stuttgart area, and she'd immigrated when she was 21 years old to America. And she became, because she didn't speak English, as many first generation immigrants to America did not, and that's something well worth remembering now. Um, she was German speaking. She became a cook, a cook for a catering company. And so what happened was, she had these two daughters, one of whom was my adoptive mother. And my parents couldn't conceive at that time. In vitro fertilization was way off, and on the horizon, and it wasn't a part of the picture. So my grandmother's brother, back in Germany, back in the Stuttgart area, um, was a child psychologist. He was the sociologist, child psychologist. He studied children's learning, and he ran the orphanage where I was. So um, when it came time for them to, when they said, we're trying, we can't conceive, my grandmother said, why don't you adopt? I'll get in touch with my brother. And she did, and he sent this handful of photographs. I accidentally found the envelope with the photographs in it one time when I was poking through my mother's desk drawer surreptitiously. Anyway, they picked me out of a batch of photographs, and it was my grandmother who flew back to Germany, and I came out of the orphanage, and she brought me by train, and she brought me to the station, and from the station to the airport, and over back to Philadelphia International Airport. But because of her role in it, she was so proud. She basically could never shut up about it. When she would introduce me, she would say, "This is my granddaughter. I got her from Germany, and here are her parents." My parents, I think my parents could have done without the whole story. I think they could have just, look, we're trying to make a family here. It was the 1950s. We're just trying to be normal. We've got this kid. We've changed her German name. Now she can be American. You know, I always would go to school. When I'd go to school, they'd say, where were you born? I'd say Stuttgart. My mother was like, well, why did you have to tell them that? I was like, because it's true, and I was also infected by my grandmother's honesty. I mean, she was a great champion of mine and a real angel of my life. I worked with her in the catering company when I was like 12 and 13. I was underaged and all of that. But, we used to, into my teens, maybe I wasn't that young. Maybe I was 15. But I worked for her catering company, was alongside of her, adored her. And she was the one that was always very candid. Um, and in the book, I talk about going back to Germany with her. She took me back to Germany when I was 17. I went to the orphanage. I met her brother. And it wasn't until, actually, this is so embarrassing. When you say, is it evolving? It wasn't until last summer. I was sitting with this person who ran the orphanage, his daughter, one of my aunts, and sitting around having coffee and cake in the afternoon. Thank goodness for this custom in Germany, tea in England and coffee in Germany, and we don't even have that here, please. And anyway, having this leisurely afternoon, and the daughter said, I said, she said, I read your book. The one thing that wasn't true was that my father always wanted you to know your origins. He wanted you to know about your biological mother, and he wanted you to know all the facts. As a psychologist, he knew it was tremendously important, and it was your parents who said no. So it was something that's, another thing you have to swallow. I respect it. They were trying to create this life. As a result, did I always know? I always knew through my grandmother, and I just never know. I never knew who was there, who it was about. It wasn't until after I met my biological mother's family that I learned that I think everyone's pretty sure. She did try to make contact with my parents at one point. It was a closed adoption, as adoptions were, but she found a way, and they turned her aside. So it was not to be that I was ever to meet her. But I have that letter, and it's in the safety deposit box at the bank.
Wow, it's unbelievable. It's quite something. Out of interest, I mean, your time sort of back in New York and all the rest. What did you do in that time? Because you went back to you did a master's degree. Then you were saying more recently.
Right. Well, when I met my future husband, who I'm married to, Peter, he, in the book, he's called Bert, but everybody knows he's Peter. I had to change the names. When the book came out, it turned out that everybody was only too happy and actually disliked their fake names. So I don't know. I was trying to protect people's privacy, and everyone has said, no, please. It was like, why did you name me that? I mean, it's a stupid name. Anyway, Peter, to whom I'm married, we went on this date in New York City, and I was working at the gallery. I almost didn't go on the date because he lived in Connecticut. Connecticut. I mean, Connecticut is where people wear pink and green and have leopard loafers, kind of like it's a very kind of, has a very waspy kind of tradition, very traditional. I was in New York. I was amidst people in the art world. I didn't want to go back in time to, so I was a little put off by this Connecticut thing. And then I met Peter, and then it was all too clear right from the get go that I was in love with him. And um, Connecticut was going to become unavoidable. So what happened was I studied and I got this certificate from NYU in art appraisal. I founded my own art appraisal business, and that was actually great fun and experienced an entrepreneurial side I didn't know I had. Um, was doing well until the economic downturn of 2008 and 9. But by that time, Peter, whose job was based in Connecticut, was transferred to Florida, of all places. I don't know if you realize it, but Florida is where you go at the end of the line. That's where you go to retire. No one comes back from there. No one hears from you from there. It's really that's the end of the line. So it's like I thought, oh no, I'm going into oblivion. I got down here. I started really loving it, not least because there was all this water and boats and things that I was really used to and loved from my childhood. And I started realizing there was this lively arts community here, not sustainable enough to have an appraisal company. So I got to thinking about what I might really like to do. Peter was off at work. I was nesting, making the house, and I decided that online learning would be the thing to do. And remember, I had just gone through this upheaval of finding out my biological father. That was 2002. This was 2010. So I kind of came up for air, right? I couldn't keep doing what I had been doing before. And I decided to go back to school online to get a master's degree in mental health counseling and to learn about all these psychological theories of why I was the way I was, why adoptees were the way they were, what really happens to you physically, emotionally, kind of seeking explanations for things and for why I was the way I was. And just trying to put it into a context, I really thought I could go back and help adoptees. I knew Florida had a big foster care system. There's lots of adopted families. Part of the master's degree was having a practicum. I was counseling adoptive kids. It seemed to have a really great, like there were legs to it. And thank goodness it was distance learning, because in the middle of all of it, we were transferred back to Basel, Switzerland, where I could continue my online studies. And Peter, went back to the home office. I could spend some time with Otto, could travel up to northern Germany. This is why I was able to reconnect as much as I did. But, counseling adoptive children is very difficult, especially when, I had just kind of come through it as an advocate for clarity, for divulging the truth, for being open. And I came smack across, right into the face of things again, that adoptive families, no matter how liberal, no matter if they're same-sex marriages, no matter what, they don't want their kids to know. They don't want their kids to have contact. And it was such a very personal place in my heart that I had come so far in learning that it was very hard for me to have these kinds of situations where I needed to be counseling people who just wanted their kids to assimilate. Why couldn't they just be normal? And I eventually just decided to write my book instead.
So when did the book process start and come to fruition then?
Well, it was a great thing. I fell and hit my head in 2016. I was counseling. It wasn't a serious brain injury, but I realized, unbeknownst to me, I had an underlying thyroid condition that had been undiagnosed. And, in that recuperation period, like those times are the times when you really get to thinking, okay, what now? Obviously I've been put past the point of exhaustion in doing what I'd been doing. And so that was 2016. And I committed myself to, I'd been taking writing courses ad hoc all along, like on and off, up in New York at NYU. And I started going to, and in 2015, um, as a result of being an art appraiser, a woman had contacted me in New York, and she wanted her sister's art collection to be appraised. Her elderly sister had just passed away, and I noticed this woman's signature on her email. She was a book agent. And I said to her, so this was like 2015, and I said, I'm not an art appraiser anymore. I've moved to Florida. Um, but I've got this story. I've got this story that's been happening, and I might like to write about it. And she said, "Tell me." And I think we met in New York. She said, "I'm very interested in it. If you write that book, I will represent you." And we kind of took it from there. I went to writing workshops that she referred me to, several of them over the course of the next 3 years, and then continued on into, up until this year, when I think things are getting canceled this summer. But Pete, I mean, I still go to writing conferences to learn more. It's an infinite subject and craft. So I was fully absorbed from 2016 to 2018, and the book was published in 2019 by She Writes Press, which is an indie publisher in California. I couldn't be more proud of it. And She Writes Press is led by a woman called Brooke Warner, who was helping me to edit the book. My agent had introduced me to Brooke. My agent, April Eberhard, had introduced me to Brooke. Brooke helped me edit it. And then the last night of editing, that was also long distance. I remember being kind of exhausted on the phone. We got to the last page, the last scene, the last words. And I was like, wow, that's it. Like, wow, it feels so light. And Brooke, the publishing company, I'd like to publish this. And so I thought to myself, I'm a very lucky girl. I'm a very lucky woman. And I said yes on the spot. So it was published in 2019. It's won several awards. It's won an award from the Nonfiction Authors Association, a silver award. And it's won another award from the Living Now Association. And it's been lovely. It's been lovely communicating with people. As a result, you get to talk to people like you who ask very penetrating questions and things that I haven't thought of. So it's just been wonderful being able to kind of come out of my shell and out of my existence and into the world at large through it.
Out of interest, what's your main output? I mean, obviously the art has taken a huge part of your life, but also now with creating in terms of writing. I mean, do you lean towards creating as in painting or writing? Do any of those outlets come to you?
I have painted, and I do a lot visually, but the problem with visual arts for me, and I still look at art all the time. I'm so lucky because Peter has two daughters from his late wife, and one of them is in the arts, and she and I share, Instagram and share, WhatsApps on what's going on in the art world. I love art. Um, I've gotten quite literal these years, and I like the spoken or written word. I find that I love the interpretive world of visual arts. I love being able to create meaning for what I see. I think it's tremendously important that people have that kind of subjective experience, that it's private, what they see, and there's a world that forms between the viewer and the piece of art. But for me now, you can understand the interest and actually the sense of urgency and actually the fire in the belly around being explicit, about being very clear, and about investigating through words and through language, verbally and through writing. It's just gotten very important for me to hear other people's stories, to promote other people's stories, about who they are. Um, it's just become my subject. I feel as though it's a part of me and I can't really move away from it. It's really at the center. And I'm only just grateful that I can still, as we all can, when we're allowed out again, circulate among other kinds of arts. Yeah, I love different kinds of arts, but this is my focus. And this is where my meaning resides now.
It's quite interesting in your language. You predominantly kinesthetic, it seems, but with a mix of visual.
Mm-hmm. So kinesthetic is movement, though, right?
Mm.
Or
The sensory, the doing, the touching, the how it feels, and
yes.
the feeling side of it, and how that felt and what it was. But then obviously the visual side seems to come into play also, which it seems, it doesn't seem to be as strong, but makes sense in terms of the art and things like that.
Well, I would say that I used to be very cerebral. When Brooke first got a hold of my manuscript, she was like, "Okay, what are you trying to say here? What in this scene that you've reported so detailed and visually, I could the minutia. I mean, I'm creating right now an audio book of my book and reading my book. Even now, it's just I can't believe how immersed I was in the visual world. Of course, it's only logical, right? But um, the thing is, I used to approach writing as this kind of visual reporting. And I had to get that knocked out of me. I was I was at a writers conference here at Eckhart, with Andre Dubus the third, who is a novelist. He wrote, he's also a memoirist. His memoir is called Townie, and he's also written his oh my god, brilliant and famous novel that was made into a film with Ben Kingsley. It's right here on my shelf, so I will tell you in just a second. House of Sand and Fog. Anyway, I was in the class with Andre, and he was like, okay, we all had to read our manuscripts to one another. And he was like, okay, but here, like, what what was the sense that you were having? What were all of his exercises, all of his writing exercises ask that we go down deep into our senses. Why? Because that's how we know things. That's how we're in contact with our intuition. That's how we're in contact with our feelings. The minute you start talking about, okay, create the smells of your mother. Mine would be like black coffee, smoke, because she smoked for a long time, Norwell perfume, laundry detergent. I mean, and the hydrangea bush outside. Those are evocative. And the minute you're in those sensory notes, you're in a different experience than you are when you're saying, here's my mother. She's 5'2". She dresses impeccably. No one can see any of that. You can describe it as detailed as you like, and no one can get immersed in it, including you as the author, as the writer. So, what do we want to do? Do we want to stay on the outside of the experience? No. We want to do a deep dive. We want to be, in this essence, re experiencing the experience in order that we deliver it as well and truthfully as we can and faithfully on the page so that the writer can have the same experience or the experience that they're provoked by reading it.
Well, really interesting. I've just a couple of last questions really. Just how do you learn? What's your learning style?
Um, it's changing for all of us, right? Because we're getting more digital. I too love listening to podcasts. I love reading. I still am a voracious reader. I still run to books when I'm uncertain about something, which is fairly frequent. Am, and I learn because something's gotten uncomfortable in me. So I seek the podcast, or I seek the voice that sounds like, that resonates, like fire in the belly. I was like, no, I resonate with that. Um, and I seek it out. So um, it's just gotten to be many more medium than we had before. But I learn by going into classrooms. I learn by reading other people's material. I have one writing teacher who's completely autodidactic, self-taught, Ann Hood, and she's learned by just breaking down other people's work. And by having classes with her, I've learned to do that kind of thing, to analyze things as a writer, to deconstruct things. I learned because I have a writer's circle here. We always share new work. Writing always, or learning, sorry, is always some form of communication, right? Communication is what enables us to learn. We read it on the page, we hear it, we share it verbally, we see it, it's some exchange. And that emotional exchange is what you're really looking for when you're writing, and when you're learning too. When you really resonate with something, it goes deep inside you. Then you're really learning at like a different level.
Well, was it? Out of interest, do you think you've had a previous life or before all this?
It's so interesting that you should ask that, because last week I had a witch on my show dropping in, and she was quite n- not just certain. She'd based her she had three novels that she'd previously written before the memoir that I looked at. Quite a good one, actually. Um, and this is a woman called Caradwyn Falling Star. And her two previous novels were her 16th century existence in her previous incarnation in Scotland, and the other was 12th century Japan. And I can tell you, I have no such inkling. I've never done a past life regression. Um, I'm sort of the school that energy, which is what we are, which is what we consist of, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So I can't refute the idea of a previous existence or reincarnation. Certainly, as a physicist, being exposed to physics growing up, I obviously believe in energy as being, it just transmutes, it transforms, but it doesn't become extinct. So I don't I can't say. I don't know where I came from. I don't know where I'm going. Sometimes I don't even know why I'm here. But I feel like that puts me in pretty good company, because most of us don't. And I I'd love to. The first time I went to Ireland, the first time went to Ireland, I was coming back from Switzerland on one of these trips with Peter. We'd gone to visit Otto and also Peter's family, and we'd no sooner taken off. We'd flown over France and the UK, and just over the UK, the pilot announcement came on. Folks, sorry for the disruption. We've got to make an emergency landing. We have a sick passenger on board. It's a dire circumstance. We regret the inconvenience. We'll be landing in Dublin. And we started circling Ireland. And I looked out the plane window and I just went into shock. The color of this countryside. And there was something that, like, it shot into me, like it was an energy. And I thought to myself, I have to come back to this place. I made a mental note. I have to come back to this place. So, you know, how long do you know something before you finally act on it? Or how long do you know something before you finally accept it? It wasn't for several years until I got invited to this writers' conference in Dingle, and went there. And when I walk on those moors and or walk and see those ruins, those Celtic ruins, I mean, I feel a reverberation unlike anything. Um, and of course, ancestry.com doesn't fill that in. Um, and I have to think there's something to it, but I have nothing confirmed. There are places that I get inklings that are more than just, average vibrations. And the Celtic, that region that has the Celtic past is one of them. And when I heard the music, I just about went into outer orbit. I said to Peter, am I the only one that feels completely transported here in this pub by these songs that are like the same songs that have been sung for hundreds of years, but they just sound so vibrant. So maybe I'm open to it.
Wow, that's amazing. You mentioned there Miss America.
Oh yeah.
What was that? So,
Well, that was, sad but true. I mean, I just was not comfortable. Can you imagine trying to have to live up to Miss America? When we finally saw the Miss America pageant on the little tiny TV set, black and white, 10 inches on the boat. I mean, I wrote this piece about it. I don't think it's in this book. It's not in this book. Um, Maybe in another book, but Miss America, you have to do the bathing suit contest. You have to do the scholarship contest. You have to do the debating contest. You have to do the beauty. You have to be everything. I mean, the pressure was just, I was like, couldn't you have just named me after like Lassie or, a dog that it's like there's no pressure. But no, I had to be named after Miss America. So I got the message that I was supposed to assimilate, right? And I tried. I tried my best. I can honestly say, though, I mean, academic success, that was my own. I owned it. My parents did not wrap my knuckles or anything. Once I got a hold of something or a subject and I was interested, I mean, there was no taking me away. So I'm just glad I don't have to do the bathing suit contest and that things have changed.
certainly are. It's different times, very different times. Um, Last question, really. Favorite artist? Is there anyone that stands out for you?
I do have favorite artists, visual artists, you mean? Yeah, visual artists. Well, one is in my house. She is not in my house, and actually, her work is not in my house. But at one point, I met her, and she inscribed a poster from one of our gallery exhibitions, and that's Helen Frankenthaler. I love the abstract expressionist school that was in New York in the 70s. And so, de Kooning, Clifford Still, Helen Frankenthaler. But I would say Helen Frankenthaler I love very much. It's this wash of color. It's abstraction. It's very emotional to me. Um, and yet, it doesn't insist that you know what it is. It doesn't insist that you know the story. Um, and yet it's very real and very reverberant to me. I see lots of artists that I connect with, but I've always loved, yeah, de Kooning, certainly, um, Hoffman. I'm thinking of the person that actually Helen Frankenthaler was married to. Um, Several who did the Open series. As you can tell, it's been a little too long since I've been away from that world. But yeah, Helen Frankenthaler, I would say, is a favorite. Right now, there's a minimalist exhibition in New York at MoMA that I would love to see. Carl Judd, or wait, Donald Judd. Carl Andre was his contemporary. Yeah, Donald Judd. I'd love to see that sculptural exhibition at MoMA. It's on the top galleries and it's lit only by natural light. I love minimalist art. I love things that are stripped away. So that's in direct contradiction to some of the more expressionistic gestural moves by Frankenthaler, maybe. But you need to have both. And I I think one of the things that this pandemic is showing us is we could live much simpler lives. We don't really need very much. And to be visually decluttered and simplified helps sometimes to refresh your mind and to kind of get clear about what you're thinking and where you'd like to go. So minimalist art does that for me.
It's quite interesting. It seems to be a slight default position that you go back to countryside or you go back to basics,
Mhm.
and uh, any opportunity you get, and almost the same in reflection, slightly in art, that your art with natural light, go back to nature. Seems to be a,
I'm always looking for that escape hatch. I think this is a perfectly good excuse right now. The pandemic. No, you're absolutely right. It's a default setting. I feel nourished in very simple environments. I'm very, I'm one of the things. This is so unfloridian, but it's done, but not frequently. I've just started a vegetable garden here, and so that's another one of these like back to the roots kind of things. I maybe in times of stress or transition, yeah, I do need to do those. I have always loved to cook. I love to cook for other people, so it's a little difficult right now. Um, I particularly like to cook for a lot of people, which I think comes from my grandmother, the catering days of being in there in the kitchen with the pot that was taller than her head and all of it, and her wonderful cooking and teaching. Um, it's a very elemental. I like that feeling. I think elemental strips away some of the more cerebral layers where you stop being able to put labels on things. You stop being able to identify everything you're feeling, and you just are, and you just find a way of being and sensing. And I think those are very instructive moments. So maybe that's what I should have, maybe that's one of the points I could have, that I overlooked in myself. You've revealed something. Yeah, I like just sensing things.
mm, it's a very, very strong. It's a very strong emotion, in the sense of what it is, but also very interesting that you talked about right at the start. You talked about identity, and searching and things like that. So it's interesting. I think the your the overall view.
It's
Just
layering, right? It's
mm,
layering.
absolutely. But I think, well, the overall take is whilst all the layers are built up, you actively go back and strip back the layers as well through time. To
I
get.
excavate. Yes, I like to say I excavate. I have to excavate. And because, and Cara Dwynne was actually talking about this, like, you shed your skin, your identity. I'm, of course, fascinated by you that you ask all of these incredibly intelligent questions. But I suspect you had a different existence at one time. And, we do that. We build up the layers and then we discard ones that we no longer identify with. It's evolving all the time. The intuitive patterns are getting revealed. So the more you connect with your intuition and act on it and its implications, the more it's available to you. So you get more in touch with your sort of unconscious and your unconscious urges. And that tells you different things than your mind tells you. And so, seeking that balance, sometimes this layer goes or this layer goes, or, absolutely. They're shedding skins, and we're shedding skins all the time. And collectively, I'll be very interested to see which skins we've found to be extraneous after this is solved. I mean, brilliant scientists are at work as we speak, and incredible healthcare workers are at work as we speak, protecting us. And something's got to come of this. It's a crucible, I think.
It certainly is. It's very different times, and
Mhm.
there whatever the new normal will be, we'll find out in due course. Talk to us about your podcast, Dropping In.
I love dropping in. It's okay. So I had one of these people who I've served dinner to casually said one night, "Hey, when we were growing up, we used to just drop in. We nobody made appointments. Now people make phone appointments. Everyone's busy. No, could I have to reschedule? I have to, you know." People just used to drop in. I'm thinking to myself, dropping in. I remember dropping in. People would drop into the living room. And dropping in, of course, has another meaning, which is dropping into a conversation or, dropping into a subject or dropping into ourselves. So dropping in is, it's my podcast, and I talk to, so far, it's been authors, lucky enough to know authors, one of whom was a musician. And that was great fun. D.L. Byron, who wrote the book Shadows of the Night, and the record Shadows of the Night, the song by Pat Benatar that won a Grammy. He was my first guest. So we're all just looking at what's creativity, what's identity, how are these things related, how are we keep moving forward, how the creative energy works, no matter what field it is. And I'm being encouraged by some of my advisors to go into to expand my notion of creativity to include other kinds of people. But yeah, that's what I do. I read that person's book. I do close read. I interpret it as much as I can, and I try to get to the points that are like you do, delving in, that are dropped in, that are maybe not surface things. And yeah, you'd be surprised what comes out. People are just utterly fascinating. They don't have to be famous, but they're utterly fascinating.
Oh, the journey that people have been on, and the worst thing you can do is mind read, and says, "Oh, I think I know you," is like, you don't. There's few people know each other until, and unfortunately, the art of conversation. I don't know, a lot of people, they've lost the art of actually asking the question or taking time to listen. And it's sad, but I mean, I love on your website, the DianeDewey.com is, it's go deeper, go strong, go stronger, and find your truth. I think that they're just great. It's a great mantra, if you like, as well. You know,
Thank you. Those were, you can feel those little bumps. You can almost feel like going down, like you bump off that step and you bump into the next step and you bump out, and then you come out and you say, you know what? I feel good about it. I feel um, much less perfect, much more human. And, as you say, we don't know one another. And that's both the glory and the challenge. We have to communicate. And I think the more that we connect with one another at some ineffable stage, at some ineffable layer, um, that's, to me, that's somehow what it's all about. That feels like what it's all about.
that makes sense. So tell me, two things: do you like yourself? Do you love yourself?
I think it's very dangerous sometimes to love yourself too much. I was as an only child, as an adopted child, I was loved. I felt forever inner inwardly scarred. I think inwardly, not just scarred, but like inwardly unworthy. And one of the great authors, Nancy Verrier, talks about this in her book, The Primal Wound of Adoptees. Never. We are always besmirched. We always, our view of ourselves is always just, it's from the perceived rejection. And I think that, like I hear stories of people who say that through abuse, they always feel dirty, they're sullied. And I can somehow tentatively identify with some of those feelings. I think that it's good to get to this point in life where you have experienced enough stages that you have some trust in yourself and that you have some trust in your nose, to be doing what's right and to be doing something that's good for you and others, hopefully. And I think that I've come to a point of peace, of being much more comfortable with myself. I don't have to be Miss America. I don't have to shoehorn myself anymore. Um, I've always enjoyed my own company, for better or worse. I've always been somewhat solitary. So that makes it misery for my husband probably some of the time, although he's, thank goodness, of the same persuasion. Um, and I think, so I think there's a level of acceptance, Pete. I can't say it's not self-love. I think self-love is a little scary. I think I certainly have learned to be good and decent to myself and to treat myself with respect. The poet David White says, goodness knows that if we actually treated ourselves the way we would like others to treat us, or if we treated others the way we treat ourselves, it would be a bloodbath, because some of us are unmerciful critics of ourselves. What we need to learn is just to be good and decent to ourselves. I don't think it's about pampering. I don't think it's about entitlement. I think, on the contrary, it's about really staying connected to ourselves and our values, and actually not indulging in a whole lot of hyped up self-love. Just staying connected is hard enough. And I think the result is just a comfort level, that you're freer to be who you are. And that's sort of it for me.
Oh, very interesting. I mean, it's interesting. It's like someone was saying the other day. You should love the way you love your pet. You love yourself the way you love your pet.
Oh dear, I'd be smothered.
Yeah, that's the thing. Your dog Peppy is. I thought it was great. Well, what make was Peppy, by the way?
That was a whippet, a tawny colored whippet. They're very beautiful dogs. With those eyes almost growing out of their tiny heads, and on the narrow nose. And I remember just looking at it sideways looking at her sideways on the carpet. Pippi got hit by a car, which was very sad. And she had little wheels on the back of her legs. Her legs were dysfunctional after that. And so that was the first loss, was losing Pippi, because she eventually was put down. But yeah, if I was to love myself the way I love my dog, I think that would be disgraceful, because just first of all, it's way too much affection. And, obviously he's got something to say about it too. You can see he's not always into it, but like, here she comes again, wanting to snuggle. Um, I don't think it's about that. I mean, maybe for some people it is, and I certainly give them that. And a lot of people have had to work their way back from hardship in order to be able to say those things. So I give them credit. It's not my way. I need to stay something more fundamental. Um,
Hmm,
just
interesting.
Yeah.
I love it. So tell me this: what is your fire in the belly?
Well, right now, I want very much to go forward with the idea of intuition, and how it's guided me finally, but how it guides us. I still think it's an undiscovered, or an unexplored journey in a there are places that we come to in society, in our culture, where we just know it just doesn't feel right. No, that does not feel right. That, when you're looking at that, you know, oil slick on the Gulf, or you're looking at that, the oil slicked bird, or, you're looking at the deforestation of the Amazon, and the wild animals fleeing because they have no habitat. And then something like COVID-19 happens because animals are so stressed that they're actually disease carriers. You just know. You just know. I mean, at a collective intuitive level, at a cellular memory level, something's not right. This isn't right. And I think we need to kind of explore that together. And I think that what I'd like to do now is to go back and retrieve the intuition, to report on the intuition, the intuition, that the things that have helped me, the times when I have had signposts that I obeyed. And so that we can somehow start to really acknowledge together things that we know don't feel right. And to, instead of saying, but we've got to go down that path anyway, to say, no, we don't. And try to make some kind of choices that are different than that. I mean, that's it.
Well, it's fascinating. I love that. I love that view. It's quite something. So tell me, how do people reach out to you?
Uh, I love people reaching out to me. It's Diane at dianedewey.com is the easiest way. And I'm on Facebook, Diane Dewey. I think it's Diane Dewey 1 or Diane Dewey 3. You'll see it's there. And actually, Fixing the Fates has its own Facebook page. Way too complicated. I just want to get back to it's. You're right. I'm in that paring down. Facebook is Diane Dewey. Instagram, Diane Dewey. I really, I tweet sometimes. And I love hearing from people, particularly people far away, because wow, doesn't it make you feel good to be connected this way? I'm also very, very grateful that my father, in all his wisdom and his early scientific engineering wisdom, bought Apple stock. And now I look at this, absolute rearrangement of our economies, our global economies. And not only do I appreciate the digital world day to day for the connection that we have and the lack of isolation, that we've been saved from a feeling of isolation by it, but also just in very real terms to have had someone in my family who was visionary that way to say, okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to sock away this pension money and I'm going to buy Apple stock. And I honestly, there wouldn't be any going back to secondary education to get my graduate degree, my master's in mental health counseling, if any of that hadn't happened. It's these are things that are tangible and intangible supports, and right now they're very real. So I appreciate it, and I love staying connected, and you know, I think so do all of us. We need to have that human party.
That's amazing. Do you know, it's an amazing story, and I think I could actually listen to you all day long.
Thank you.
It's
You
fascinating.
couldn't.
It's
You draw your finger across the throat. And so, but I appreciate the fact that you've been such an amazing listener and also such a probing interlocutor, a questioner, inquiring mind. I mean, just really a joy. I really appreciate it and your conversation. I'm rarely at the receiving end of this, Pete. So
it's it, it's
I
always interesting to turn the mics on an interview. You know, it can be interesting. Just remind us then. So, Fixing the Fates is the book, and it's available on Amazon and through your website, right?
That's right. It's available wherever books are sold. At your indie bookstore, you can order it. You can order it in Europe. I ordered it at my local bookstore in Switzerland and in our little village there. But it's Fixing the Fates, and it's published by She Writes Press. It's by Diane Dewey. Yeah, you can get it anywhere. And soon, someday, you can get it as an audiobook. It's available as an ebook as well.
I love it. I love it, and I love the fact you're recording it yourself as well because you have a great voice. So it's going to be
Hmm.
fantastic.
Hope so. Thanks. You should hear the stumbling. The stumbling is also good for digital engineering, right?
Keeps the editors busy. You know, that's cool.
Oh,
Diane, thank you so much. It's been lovely to have you on, and we look forward to seeing where you go in future. So thank you again.
it's been a deep pleasure. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, Pete. What a great program you have.
Thank you.
Take good care.